Well, hi there. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Happy half hour to you. And here's my toast. I'm so glad that you joined me. My name is Susie Schultz. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Broadcast Communication, which is located in the heart of Chicago. And here we go. I love those chimes, the MBC chimes. It's something that I kind of during the pandemic I brought home with me to keep safe here at the house, and I will be returning it to the museum so that you'll be able to see it. But it's nice to have it here. It's our call to chat and talk a little bit about what's going on at the museum. And today I'm very excited. I really love talking to this gentleman, Jim Engel, who's here with us to talk about children's television. He's the curator of children's TV at the museum, and has a wealth of knowledge, information, great stories, behind the scenes stuff, as well as perspective historically on children's television and its import. If you joined us last week, we talked a little bit to Jim as well, and we're going to continue that conversation because we didn't even touch on a whole bunch of wonderful things that I want you to know about. Hi, Jim. Good to see you
Oh,
again.
delighted to be back. It's like
It's
like
always fun.
way to talk about kids TV, but you're able to do it, so I'll do it.
Well, and you've got some of the biggies in back of you, don't I? See you have Fraser Thomas right over your
I,
shoulder.
I have my two favorites. Yeah, Fraser Thomas, Garfield Goose, and then Bill. This is odd. Bill Jackson and Cartoon Town. Those are the two shows that kind of bookend my interest in kids TV personally, because as a kid, Garfield Goose was the first show that just really became an obsession for me. And then later in life, well, a little later in life, mid 60s on through the mid 70s, Bill Jackson shows just captivated me as they did a lot of people. And he lasted into the kind of like the late 70s, which is by that time this whole kind of kid TV thing with hosts and puppets and characters was largely dead. So he nurtured it along for me, so that as I was well beyond the age most people would watch those shows, but a lot of people that watched them were because he was just so hip and it was such a great show. So yeah, those are my two absolute favorites amongst a lot of shows I love.
Well, and those are the ones I kind of wanted to dig into a little bit more because they're just so wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about that era of puppets? I mean, puppets were really thought of as were they thought of as a way to reach kids, or were they just the easy thing to do?
I think it would be safe to say that in the early days of television, when all this stuff started, nobody had any sense of trying to reach kids. The WGN folks were very consistent in saying that they felt there was enough serious stuff going on in kids' lives between their home lives and school that they really viewed their shows as a way to just provide kids with relaxation, the same way that a dad might come home at night and turn on the television. Now, we can get into it later, but Bill Jackson and Garfield Goose, they did have educational aspects to them, but not in sort of a boring, dry way. And as far as puppets go, in the early days, well, I'll compare it to this. When movie theaters became big, when movies came in after regular theater existed, and you see these photos of the old movie palaces, and they're unbelievable, literally palaces, and guys in uniforms took you to your seat, and they were huge, and they were gilded and everything. It was because they came along after regular theater, and people had expectations. So it sort of legitimized movies as a way to spend your time. Similarly, I think when television comes along, it would never occur to anybody to just have a show where they ran three Bugs Bunny cartoons or four in a half hour at the end. The cartoons that they were showing on TV had just been released to TV, and so all these local shows viewed it as we have to like frame that. Those things are features on it, but they're just one of the things we do. That's why there are all the various captains and uncles and clowns, etc., that all these shows had. And in addition to that, either other human performers that were part of them or puppets. And on television, puppets really come off well. Even like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, where they didn't even venture out of the normal, proscenium, the little square window that the puppets just behind. And a show like Bill Jackson, where he moved his puppets around the set, the way that, say, Jim Henson did. But puppets are great on TV, and Garfield Goose and Bill Jackson both owe a lot to my personal, passion and profession, which is cartooning, because the two main guys behind some of the greatest features of the shows wanted to be cartoonists. and they got into television. So as a result, their sensibilities in creating their puppets, I think, was above and beyond a lot of the puppets on TV. You can look, if we ever put them back on display. Here's Geraldine, which is probably one of my earliest TV memories. Was a Jim
Oh my
Stewart host.
God.
Yeah. Now, if you look, and when I first put those puppets on display, or first saw them on display there, I was amazed because there's a character on the show named Helen Hippo, and she's
I'm gonna,
got a.
I'm gonna stop you a minute and I'm gonna take you back and I want you to explain to people the show and the premise because it just was a little magical.
Oh, well, Here's Geraldine was a television show, and it was a puppet show, puppet characters. Jim Stewart was the host. He was a live action guy, played guitar, talked to the characters. A lot of people may know him because he also had a show on Channel 7 called Passage to Adventure that was made up of footage from real safaris he went on. And he had a wife named Bud Stewart who did the puppets and did the voices. And they are kind of stand out for me because the puppets had such great personality, and the rapport between Jim and his wife was so excellent on that show, and it was just a great show. But the first time I saw the real puppets, they're an example of puppets by necessity. So Geraldine is a giraffe, but her antlers are made out of baby bottle nipples. A lot of early characters had buttons for nostrils. But what really floored me was if you saw the puppet on that show called Helen Hippo, there was a construction of a hippo head, and then it was covered in white fabric, little button eyes, and then her nostrils, which are a big feature on a hippopotamus character. It's like somebody drew them on with a pen and then decided they didn't like the positioning, so they drew them again, like right above the previous. They didn't put a new piece of fabric over it. So if you ever see the puppet, it's literally got four nostrils. And once I became aware of that, I could see it in all the old photos I collected from it and stuff like that. And you can see it on the one surviving TV clip. But I always tell people this. There's people who think like, oh, there were 5 Garfield gooses. I knew a guy who thought he bought a Garfield goose. I'm like, there are no other Garfield goose. Yeah, well, maybe they had some for TV appearances, like, or for special appearances, public appearances. And like, no, they didn't. The thing everybody forgets about this stuff, if that were the case, the Garfield goose that we all know in the museum would not be as beat to heck as it is. But it's the puppet
That
that got
that
used.
is
He
that
got used
is
day.
I'm so sorry. I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, I always tell people this. Those stations were dealing in commerce, not art. We might regard it as art. They may have produced art, but their goal was to fill time and make a show. That's why all these shows were erased. A show like Garfield Goose is on for 20 plus years, and there's no existing shows because we need more videotape. We'll tape over it. So nobody was going to go back and remake this puppet to draw the nostrils better or do a better job on the nostrils. It's like we got a show to put on it. It's fine. It will do. So I think a
And
lot of the
that
puppet.
Go
No,
ahead.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead.
I
I
was
was
just
going
going
to
to
say,
say
and
a lot.
okay, here we go.
No,
I'll
we love a lot of
you.
the stuff regardless. We fill in the gap. The gap between how good it was or how good we thought it was is our own love for it. That's we fill that in. So
That is so true, and I know that I mean I loved Garfield Goose. I used to spend time talking just like Garfield Goose, and when my kids were born, I would talk to them and about breakfast. It would come up, from the from I would go underneath the counter, and there would be a
yeah.
puppet talking. We did not know that it was Garfield Goose, but in my mind, it was Garfield Goose because
Oh
that
yeah.
ridiculous goose was so I just the whole premise of it was magical, and I know that you have said that there wasn't an educational component that
Well,
people were thinking, but the
you
imagination there.
you could learn from it for sure. I think Garfield Goose, which is you see, we take all this for granted. If you think about it for a minute, the premise of that show is that there's a goose who thinks he's the king of the United States. The other puppets on the show, were Secret Service agents or whatever. They had roles, but they were mostly his friends, and they hung out in the castle. And the host was Fraser Thomas, who was his prime minister, who went along with stuff. But the idea, this is the basic idea that there was, like thinking of that idea. Well, we want him to think he's king. So that was the premise of the show. Now, on top of that, um, the puppets didn't speak, and I can tell you that over the years, Fraser Thomas laid out a few different reasons for it. He didn't think it would be real. I heard him on a radio show once. He said, "Well, it wouldn't be realistic if they talked." And the person calling in on the but Cecil talks, and and Ollie talk, and he goes, "Well, to each your own," you know. But the reality of it is that if those puppeteers were speaking, then they would have to have been paid a higher fee because of the union and stuff like that. So Frasier
Wow.
comes up with the idea of the puppets don't speak; they just clack, right? So if you think about Garfield Goose, first of all, there's no audience, which is probably one of the reasons I really like it. There's no kids goofing around and distracting it. It's not like Howdy Doody. But okay, Frasier talks to this puppet, Garfield Goose. The puppet clacks a response. Then Frasier turns to Romberg Rabbit, another non-speaking puppet, and says, "What did he say?" And then and Romberg's little mouth moves like this, and he apparently says what Frasier can't understand. So, if you think of stuff like the Bob Newhart routines where he's on the phone and you're only hearing his end of it, that's kind of what Garfield Goose was. And we all accept that. I never questioned it for a moment. Why aren't they speaking? It's who they were. I love the characters. But later on, you go, but every other puppet show in the world, the puppets spoke, and let alone it's not enough that you don't understand him, or at least for a moment. You ask another puppet that can't speak what the first one just said. But that he just built on all that stuff. And he also had a lot of imaginary characters around the castle that you never saw that they referred to and stuff. The Chris Goose belonged to the Goose Boys Lodge. Their neighbor was Mrs. McGillicuddy, and it was sort of like an old radio show, like Vic and Sade or Fibber McGee and Molly or something, where there were characters that were alluded to all the time that maybe weren't even regular characters.
And
And
that era, we always called our neighbors Mrs. McGillicuddy because
yeah,
it was, those things became just so fluid. Everybody that you knew was watching it. And one of the couple of the things that you taught me that were just really wonderful when you were first showing me, our collection was again how they were doing this stuff on the slide. I said, "What do you think is the most defining moment of the Chicago School of Television?" And I think you so thoughtfully kind of you're much taller than I am, and you kind of bent down so that I could hear, and you basically said how to do um, television with almost no money.
right. Well, and that's another thing. And Bill Jackson with his shows, Cartoon Time and stuff. One of the things that people are always impressed about with that guy was that he did all the voices, he sculpted all the puppets, he built props. The show had much higher production value than any local kid show that I can think of, and certainly much more than Garfield Goose. But Garfield Goose is just a different story. But it all boils down to who are the people. So Fraser Thomas, who was a very meticulous guy, who I'm sure on Garfield Goose couldn't have stood the idea of a children in the audience, and you can tell it later on when he goes on Bozo. He's not real good with live kids, so he controlled that whole thing. And those stories and what the character said came out of his imagination, because don't forget, when those non-speaking puppets were done, he said what they said. So he was basically sitting there, inventing all this as he went along. And I have copies of the scripts. There are many in the museum. They are really kind of outlines. Fraser will say this, Gar will do that. They're by no means full scripts. Now then, he was paired with Roy Brown, who was a phenomenal puppeteer and great at getting the characters to react and stuff like that. So it was just like a lot of the early Chicago television. A good example would be Kukla, Fran, and Ellie. And between Bert Tillstrom and Fran Ellison, there was just a magic between these people. But ultimately, it comes down to who are the people, because there were a lot of lousy puppet shows. We may still kind of revere them because, as I said in our last episode, the golden age is when you were 12. So you're not going to question when you're 6 the quality of your favorite show, and you'll probably cut it a lot of slack later in life too. You were just the right age. But at any point, anybody grows up, there's good TV and there's bad TV, and it's the good stuff that sticks with you.
Yeah, and there was something magical. You're right. Those puppets never said anything, but they spoke volumes, and
I
um
know,
and and the way you knew that Garf was mad. I was trying to describe this to my boys, and I was saying, and he would do this, and then he would get
yeah,
mad, and his whole face would shake,
yeah,
and then Romberg would just be kind of calm with that one tooth coming out,
right,
and whispering slowly to and methodically to Frasier to figure out exactly what was going on. But
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of your favorites is another guy named Bill Jackson, who actually was originally brought in to go up against the iconic Bozo.
Well, he ended up doing that. He had been he learned about he was, well, when he's in the military, he was working for the military making films, and he just got the idea that it might be more more effective to use puppets or something versus some dry drill sergeant telling him. So he learned about puppets. He got out of the army
Are
and
you saying that he used puppets in the military to
oh,
teach people?
absolutely. Yeah, he was part of Armed Forces television in Hollywood, and he was tasked with making some films. And he thought, well, maybe puppets would be better. There was a local guy in L.A. named Walker Edmiston who had a great puppet show, very much like the premise of the Muppet Show, but again, nothing exists. There's some great photos. He was a live action guy. He was backstage at an old theater. He had really cool puppets. So Bill Jackson's first idea was to hire Walker Edmiston to do these films. He was too busy, but he offered to show Bill how these puppets were made. So they took him to a place called Don Post. If any of the reviewers remember, like the old famous Monsters of Filmland, all the old rubber masks of monsters that were sold in all those magazines were made by Don Post Studios. And basically, they're made out of latex. So Bill's puppets, right off the bat, were different than, say, the fabric puppets of Garfield Goose or Kukla and Ollie. He would do a sculpture, they'd make a mold, they'd keep filling it with latex. And what happens is you get a very rubbery, pliable thing. So he makes these two Martian characters. And his first thought is, I got to get somebody to do the voices. So he tries to hire Dawes Butler and Don Messick. And those were the guys that did every voice at Hanna-Barbera. Huckleberry Hound, Yogi Bear, Mr. Jinx, all of them. And they did do this stuff for him. But when he got out of the service and he wanted to get into this puppet thing a little bit, he had to do it. So he did it. And he started doing the voices for these characters, and the show's built. And then in the mid 60s, 65, he came to Chicago to WBBM and had his first show, which if you talk to him, he's not real. He doesn't really revere it the way I do, but that was the first show I saw, and I was blown away by it. So Cartoon
And what
Town,
show is that?
which is that show was called Clown Alley on Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday it was called Here Comes Freckles. And he played a clown. And notably, on all the rest of his shows after that, Bill Jackson always plays himself. He hated playing a clown, but his early puppets were on that show, and it was a great show. And when it ended, because it was, he just didn't have enough ratings, they let him use the studios to make a presentation film, and he did, and he sold the idea of doing a show to WFLD in 1968. So that's where the Cartoon Town with BJ and Dirty Dragon comes from. Now, at a certain point, they wanted to compete with Bozo, so they moved him to the noon hour and had a live audience. And instead of the puppets, they had all life-size costume figures. And I don't think anybody remembers that fondly. It was just an experiment, and it wasn't a good one. And eventually, they put him back with his regular show, and just kept the name BJ and Dirty Dragon, which had been used for that other show. But he did a lot of public appearances, so he had these big costume suits and a giant dirty dragon and stuff because he needed to be seen on stage. And he made a valiant effort. But the first time I met him and interviewed him, I asked him about it, and I said, that seemed a little odd. And he was like, "And what's your point?" I'm like, "Well, I didn't like it." And he goes, "He didn't like it either."
Well, a lot of those, and then as he moved on, a lot of his shows, his puppets were, and I know because we loop some of them in the museum, and I have to say, I cannot help but always stop and watch, because I love watching them. He used a lot of modern songs, correct, in there, and that's one of the reasons why we don't always see these shows, right?
Well,
He
yeah, that's
just
one of
gave
the
us.
reasons. That was Cartoon Town. There's not a lot of footage, but because of music rights and stuff like that, he had certain segments, and he would like play a popular song, like Sonny and Cher's "A Cowboy's Work Is Never Done" is one that survives, and he would draw scenes from it that they would show while the music played, and then there'd be a little bit of animation, maybe a horse's head moved and stuff. And then he also drew to music, so he'd play a song and he'd draw right on camera, a piece of art that reflected the song. So yeah, and he also had these great puppets people love called the Thump Twangers, which were like these hillbilly Martian birds that sang, and they would perform like lip sync to real songs too. So a lot of that makes it problematic for those songs to be, for those shows to be released what little exists because of the music rights, which is a reoccurring problem in a lot of old TV shows. If the theme song is trademarked by somebody or owned by somebody, a lot of times you can't get it on video. So, but yeah, but
and
that's the
and
thing. He was so hip. See, that was the thing. Bill Jackson was like I found a note that I wrote and I said he's like the fifth monkey or something. He had like giant sideburns eventually. He had always had sideburns. He wore this red and later a blue derby and suit. So he looked kind of Carnaby Streetish. He was a younger guy. His
He
all
was
the
very
stuff,
handsome.
yeah, I did on the show. The characters were really hip. I mean, really, I mean, it was beyond a lot of shows, and I don't mean like the way cartoons are now, where there's some sort of like off-color references for a grown-up that kid doesn't get. I just mean
Right.
that he was a cool guy doing cool stuff. For me, his frame of reference growing up was things like old movie serials. So he would do stuff like that. He'd stage a chapter a day of Dirty Dragon Meets the Monsters or Blast Off to Mars, and he just he had help. He'll be the first person to say he did have help, but he still did more than anybody far and away, and he made that show what it was. And he would draw. He'd have pictures of the clouds, and he'd see things and draw over them. And then the Blob, which everybody loves, was him turning the
I love
character.
it.
There was a
He's
lot of
wonderful.
artistic aspects to it. And when I got involved with the museum, and some of my friends we talked about it, and we brought Bill Jackson back to Chicago the first time. A lot of artists that I've met say that they were really impressed by the show growing up. Not just his drawing of cartoons, but just all the various aspects of it. And he's really always gratified to find out that he had that effect, because he initially didn't have any idea what effect he had when I first met him and before we ever brought him back. But he did, and it's no coincidence, I don't think, that a lot of artists and creative people watched and loved his show.
He was such a brilliant artist. And just go back a minute to Blob, because the Blobby was just fascinating. I mean, he was literally like a blob of clay almost,
It
right?
was 40 pounds. I know when we brought him back to Chicago the first time, and he'd been out of Chicago for decades living in LA, he sent me to the place where he bought the clay originally so I could buy the same exact clay. But basically, in Cartoon Town, there was a pedestal, like a Roman column. And on top of that sat this giant blob of clay called the Blob. And in the context of Cartoon Town, the Blob was the town monument. And so it had a face. It would always start with a face, big blobby nose. Bill would make cartoon eyes and teeth and tongues or put hats on them. But always in the context of the story, there'd be a reason to turn the Blob into something else. So in one, there's Dirty Dragon's running for president, so Blob wants to run for president, and Bill Jackson sculpts him into Uncle Sam, or he sculpts him into a gorilla, or he sculpts him into a stagecoach. Whatever was necessary, that was the fun of it. Now, what people love about that, not only was watching him do it, but the Blob didn't actually have a voice. He recorded a bunch of sounds at one point, and I'm gonna debase myself, but the Blob was like, so he
Yes.
recorded stuff once, and then he was sort of at the mercy of the sound guy who would have the Blob react however he wanted. So I sound like he's crying, and then he'd have to dress. But I would say, as much as I love Dirty Dragon and other puppets on the show, my experience has been that the single most well remembered and loved thing about Bill Jackson shows was the Blob. They just love it. We at our the last public appearance he made in Chicago, we actually had a Blob contest. We had people come up on stage and do. Everybody does the voice or thinks they do the voice, and so and he was a genius in this way. So when Cartoon Town ends and he goes over to Channel 7 and he makes Giggle Snort Hotel, then in the context of Giggle Snort Hotel, the Blob is a statue in the lobby. So everybody fit in and rolled. Dirty Dragon went from being the mailman on Cartoon Town who never would deliver mail because he'd eat the mail to fuel his inner fire, and in Cartoon Town he became the janitor because he was down in the boiler room with the furnace. So it all made sense. His characters were That's the other thing about his characters. They were completely real. I mean, anybody that watched those shows, their personalities were so consistent and they were so full blown. It's one of the beautiful things about that show is how many different characters were on each one that really were unique and stood out.
It was so creative in so many ways. And as you say, the drawings that he did. And I remember watching him form the blob into something, and I wanted to take a sculpture class, and ended up,
Uh,
I've never really gone down the road of being a great artist, but I did. When my boys were little, I had no fear of taking clay and making little eyes in it and trying to
right.
be Bill Jackson.
Well,
It was just,
I'll give
just
you a good
felt like.
example. He did the blob on Clown Alley, the clown show. And one of my best friends made a little wooden pedestal about 7, 8 inches tall, bought some modeling clay, and if you go into his room, he had a blob there that he would sculpt and resculpt with little cartoon features and stuff. And I was always like blown away by that because it was just the coolest thing, and he did it himself, inspired by the show. I will tell you parenthetically that 2 feet from where I'm sitting right now is the original blob pedestal from Giggle Snort Hotel, and
Oh my God.
it still has clay residue on it. It's still got some gray, like clay stuff in the grain of the wood and stuff like that. It's one of my
Well,
prized possessions.
I am very grateful to you because, as you have said, told me, and I think told this audience before that, it is not television wasn't a form of art necessarily when it started. It was more commerce, and things weren't saved. So the fact that you have curated and saved these things and you brought them together so that people can know the stories about the origins is just really important. It's our history, and I know that we spend a lot of time, at least in children's television, on the Chicago history of it. But Chicago was a very important place for children's television.
Yeah, well, we're lucky stuff was saved. Bill Jackson saved some of his stuff, and he'd been on a TV so long that when he brought it out to donate it to the museum, his wife had never seen it. First wife had passed away and he'd remarried. She didn't even know that much about that part of his career. But I met Roy Brown in 1994, and he had done the Bugs Bunny puppet that was on the show that was on before Ray Rayner, and it was a beautiful puppet, beautifully sculpted. And when I met him, he told me that just a week before he had thrown the mold in the garbage that had been out in his garage. And long after we knew that we had the Garfield Goose puppets at the museum, the actual Garfield Goose set was apparently in a trailer out in the parking lot at WGN and eventually was disposed of. So for every great save, there's a lot of losses in there too. And primarily the film. The film just doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, I would love everybody who's been watching today. I would love for you in the comments section, tell us a little bit about your memories of children. What was the golden age when you were 12? What was the show you were watching? And what are the things that you would like to see in a children's television exhibit? That's something that we're when the pandemic is over, and it will be over, my friends, and we come back together. That's something that we want to make sure that we put together to have those memories. So please comment below. Tell us a little bit about what you care about in children's television. And Jim, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all out there. Here's my toast to you, to Jim, and to Happy Half Hour. Have a great week. Join us again.
Bye bye.